Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Darko Audio Podcast, which is going out on YouTube. So if you're watching it, obviously you're watching it on YouTube, but it's also going out to listeners on SoundCloud, Spotify, and Apple Podcast or Apple Music Podcasts. God, I sound like a real dad saying that, don't I? Confusing Apple Podcasts with Apple Music Podcasts. They are very different things. Apple Music is a streaming service. Apple Podcast is a podcast delivery service. Anyway, this podcast is in video format, it's in audio format, and in this episode, once again, I am joined by Srajan Ebaen to discuss 4 interesting news items that we have discovered in the last, 3 to 4 weeks. Now, my choices are generally more mainstream than Srajan's, and in fact, at the end of this episode, just like the last, Srajan has a bonus spicy item that I think might challenge some viewers and listeners. But we kick off proceedings with an introduction to a new open baffle speaker from Clayton Shaw. If you want to know more about that loudspeaker, there will be links in the description box below. So yeah, let's get started.
This episode is brought to you by Bluesound, makers of the Node X network streamer. Click the link in the show notes for more information.
Okay then, Srajan, welcome back for another hour of running through news stories that have grabbed our attention in the past couple of weeks or since we last did a podcast like this. And as always, as you're the guest, you get to tee things up with the first news item.
All right. Do you remember the movie The Shawshank Redemption?
I do. You know, it's like I hear from girls that is the number one favorite movie for most dudes. When they put it in their dating profile, it's like favorite film, Shawshank Redemption. So
didn't know that.
Yeah, it's a bit of a cliche dude film, and I do know at the time of release it wasn't a big hit. It's only sort of over time that it's kind of gained a reputation as being a solid movie. It's okay for me. It's a 6 out of 10. It's not amazing, but it's not terrible. It's entertaining, you know.
Well, did you know that they have a sequel?
No, didn't know that.
It's running today on the Darko podcast.
Oh, God, very good. Oh, my goodness. Oh, it's going to be one of those episodes, isn't it? Dad jokes aplenty.
Yeah, so it's the Shawshank Redemption without the shank. All right, so Here goes. So it's 2005, and Stereophile reviews a speaker called the Elan by a company called Everett and Shaw. And the speaker is called the Elan. It's a $2,000 a pair desktop speaker. Now, we're talking a time when the majority of desktop speakers are like plastic atrocities. So for $2,000, this is like the top premium luxury league. And it's a small speaker, very elegantly made, and it has a 2.5 centimeter plastic widebander, and then it has 2 equivalent drivers firing down. Okay, and those come in at about 250 hertz. Now we're going to forward 2 years, and we're going to the Rocky Mountain Audio Fest, where a company called Emerald Physic introduces the $3,500 a pair C2. And the C2 is an open baffle speaker with a compression tweeter on top that sits inside a 12-inch waveguide. And then it crosses over to 2 15-inch woofers, all on like one plank that's maybe about this deep, and then the woofers are sticking out a little bit, right?
Yeah.
Now, this speaker does not have a crossover.
Okay.
So the way that they did it in those days was they had an outboard DSP crossover by Behringer, and that required bi-amping.
That sounds complicated.
So the Emerald Physic open baffled speakers all relied on DSP compensation to work as intended. And the biggest dealer that they have in the United States is a gentleman by the name of Walter Lederman, who runs Underwood Hi-Fi out of Lahaina in Maui, Hawaii. And he's so successful, he's heads and shoulders the most selling dealer in the United States that he ends up buying the company. Okay, so the gentleman we're talking about today is Mr. Shaw, Mr. Clayton Shaw, but he sells the company to his best dealer. Now we forward 8 years, it's 2015, and Clayton Shaw now returns with spatial audio. And spatial audio originally promotes his own DSP room correction software.
Yeah, I do remember that, and I don't recall what happened. Well, obviously nothing happened to it really of note. Well, yeah, okay, I won't preempt it.
So I actually don't know either what happened to that portion of the business. All I know is that eventually he comes out with the M3, which is again an open baffle speaker, but this time it is purely passive.
Yes.
No more outboard crossover, no more need to buy amp. Everything that the speaker needs to do is sort of built into the crossover, the passive crossover that sits embedded. I believe in those days it was embedded in the plinth behind the speaker. Had like a little box that was part of the brace. Now, earlier this year, there were reports that due to personal illness, I think resulting from an accident, Clayton once again sold a company. And then shortly after came the news that he was about to launch another new company, now called Clayton Shaw Audio Labs. Now, just a month ago or so, the Capital Audio Fest concluded. And my old contributor, Ken McCullough, who now writes for Stereophile, covered the show and wrote that Clayton, within the 3 show days, sold 120 pairs of his new speaker.
I can believe that, yeah.
Called the Caladan. And Caladan obviously goes back to the book Dune, that then became a major motion picture, part 2 to be forthcoming. Now, once again, the Caladan is an open baffle speaker, and the baffle is made out of solid wood. I have to quickly check up. Yeah, it's maple, walnut, oak, or cherry. Now, about the dimensions, because you may think open baffle has to be big. This one is just 4 centimeters shy of 50 centimeters across and 1 meter top to bottom. I measure 1 meter and 86. So for me, that speaker hits me right at the belt line. It's not a very tall speaker, but it combines 2 12-inch paper cone, Pro Audio, Bema, well, I would have just said woofers, but actually they're mid woofers, because they cross over at, let me check this out, 1 kilohertz on a second order filter to a Dayton Pro 1.125 mil Silk Dome tweeter. So Silk Dome tweeter on the top, dual 12s below. Both 12-inch woofers run in parallel. So this is a 2-way, not a 2.5-way or a 3-way. They add up to the cone surface of a 17-inch single woofer. But since we're talking about the dipole, where the driver moves air front and back, the back radiation is not captured inside the box. This is really like a 24-inch box woofer, what we've got in there. Now, 3 isoacoustic Gaia footers are included. The bandwidth for this speaker is claimed to be 32 hertz to 20 kilohertz, plus minus 2 dB. And sensitivity rates a high 93 dB at 4 ohms. And now here is the redemption part of the Shawshank Redemption Part 2, which is the price.
Okay.
The price is, now this is globally, not just in the US. This is globally shipped flat packed, $3,295. $3,295 the pair.
So he's shipping these globally now, because
he's shipping them globally.
So this was if I may interject here, this
Please.
was a big, I guess I would call it an obstacle for me, because I visited Clayton at his spatial audio facility in Utah in 2015 in the middle of winter. It was when I was doing smartphone videos, and we did an interview there, and he was telling me how, well, I think he was the guy that explained to me about the figure 8 cancellation that can trouble dipole speakers, of which open baffles are that type. and how he gets around it now by almost, I guess, not redesigning the driver, but compensating for that cancellation in the driver so that he doesn't have to outboard the compensation to DSP. And I had a pair of, oh God, was it the M4 or the M1? I think it might have been the M4, but I could be wrong. It was the most affordable pair. Clayton sent me a pair to Australia and I reviewed them. They were fantastic. They look really good. And back then he was sort of, I think his mindset was more IKEA oriented towards not just design, but also pricing. Because I think they were about $2,000, $2,500 US. And they were just a superb speaker. They were great to look at. And I wanted to get a pair here, but when I started to dig into it, there was this complicated, for me, complicated. It might not have been in reality complicated, but for me, it was complicated situation where there was a German distributor whose pricing was way out of whack with the US because he had to obviously ship these big, expensive things out of the US. And I think what ended up happening, and I could be wrong, and if I am, please let me know in the comments below, everybody, is that Spatial Europe sort of peeled off, and for a while Clayton was sending the drivers to Europe and the cabinets themselves would be made, I think, here in Germany or maybe the Netherlands, I don't know.
Well, there were no cabinets, right? They're just baffles.
Well, sorry, yes, you're right.
But yes, you're correct.
The wood.
Yes.
the wood part, right?
The plank.
Yes, the plank. That was all made here and then assembled here and then sold here. And I think that's still ongoing. But it just got really confusing. And I prefer to deal with manufacturers. I didn't really want to deal with the German distributor. And so I just dropped the ball. I was like, I can't do this because obviously Clayton's not going to send a pair into Germany when he's got a distributor here. But I didn't, no offense to the distributor here, I just didn't want to deal with them. So that was the last I heard of it until, as you mentioned, Clayton became ill. I don't know why. It's not my business. And then very recently, because he's quite, I won't say friends, I don't know whether that's the right word, but he's appeared a lot on Ron Brenet's YouTube channel under New Record Day. And so Ron has reviewed a bunch of Clayton's open baffle speakers as spatial. And I think Ron just covered the new Clayton Shaw Audio Lab speaker. What's it called again?
Caladan.
Right. So he's covered that. So I am aware of it, but just really through, by accident, just from sort of just fumbling around on YouTube, really. So I think it's going to be his last speaker as well. It's like, this is his sort of swan song, or maybe not, I don't know.
Well, okay. So there, for a while, there was a lot of conspiracy theory thinking on Audio Circle by people that said, okay, so he starts a company, he becomes successful, he sells it, and right after he opens another company that is in direct competition to the company he just sold, and look, he has done it again. Now, as it turns out, Spatial Audio just 2 days ago put out a short post on Audio Circle saying that they had just received a pallet worth of parts that they've been waiting for, and they were now finally ready to assemble Caladan and ship it to all of the waiting owners. Long story short, Clayton's old company, Spatial Audio, is actually building this speaker.
Okay. So there's no bad blood or anything like that? No, good.
None whatsoever. There was a speaker that Spatial Audio was planning to come out with, and when Clayton, who I think the story goes, built this particular speaker for himself, and then realized it was so good that he thought it should go into production. And the price point that they agreed upon him selling it was directly competing with the speaker that Spatial Audio was already working on. So that one got scratched. Clayton now sort of owns that lower price point, and Spatial Audio is going upscale. And now I have to again refer to my notes. They are working with two gentlemen, Lynn Olson and now I can't find it, and somebody else on releasing tube electronics.
Okay.
A tube preamplifier, Don Sachs and Lynn Olson. Those are the two gentlemen that are licensing or have arranged to have made by spatial audio, these electronics to be sold. And they're going to be not cheap. So it seems that spatial audio is trending to a bit, more upscale. Fully aware that Clayton has this budget or more affordable model out there. And yes, originally the story was that Clayton had like one more design. This was it. But who knows?
Who knows? It's a story
now,
with many twists and turns, right? There's going to be a twist at the end of this sequel, isn't there? We don't even know what it is yet.
Well, some creative accountant is going to laugh all the way to the bank and end up in Mexico.
Oh my goodness, don't say that. I don't want to be on the hook for some kind of legal bills myself. I'm sure everything is above board, Srajan. Nothing.
Oh, I'm sure.
But
there was one thing you said before that we actually need to correct, because the figure 8 is actually not a detriment. It's actually an advantage of open baffle speaker if you have particularly smaller rooms.
Yes.
Because the open baffle radiation, the so-called figure 8, where you have a frontal lobe and you have a rear lobe, in the middle you have the baffle where in-phase and out-of-phase radiation cancels. So you basically have no energy going to the side, which means that for all intents and purposes, your sidewalls, which are usually points of early reflections, have disappeared.
Yes, they're very good for that. Yes. Sorry.
So you can put these speakers really close to the sidewall, and the sidewall sort of won't make itself known to your ear brain as a source of reflected sound as it would with a box speaker. Now, the flip side, obviously, is that because you have bass cancellation, because the lower the wavelengths get, the longer they get, they wrap around on an open baffle, they cancel out, you're losing what's called room gain. Not all of it, but you're losing a lot of it. And if you remember...
this is where I've got confused. Yeah, okay, that makes sense. Yeah.
So when Kef Audio came out with that subwoofer that you own, what is it called? The
KC62.
62. They advertised or promoted a very sort of unrealistic looking figure of being capable of hitting 14 dB.
Yep.
Well, they didn't specify at what SPL, but they referred to 15 dB of room gain in the low frequencies. So if the average room has 6 surfaces, right, 4 walls, ceiling and floor, and we give each surface 3 dB gain, 3 times 6 is 18. So they, at 15 dB of room gain, if you're just taking out the wall behind you, that's basically what you get from a speaker that behaves omni in the bass. If you have an open baffle, you're losing the sidewalls. That's already 1/3 less room gain. You have the same cancellation going up towards the ceiling. There's another 1/6. Now, so we can see that open baffles probably have about 50% or thereabouts less room gain than conventional box speakers. So in order to make up for it, you need big cone surface.
Right.
And you also can't use a conventional woofer, because in a box, when the woofer goes into the box, it compresses the air. The air in the box can't really escape. It acts like a spring and becomes a restorative force for the driver to go back out. Right? Now you take that box away, and suddenly all that driver sees is our room air. It sees exactly the same impedance, acoustic impedance, front and back. So in order to make up for that loss of restorative force, a dipole woofer has a special suspension. The suspension components have to be stiffer. So now we're talking about the surround, and we're talking about what's usually like the rippled corrugated paper on the inside that you can't see. It's called a spider. And that's why Clayton has gone to Beamer, which is a Spanish driver company that's popular in the pro audio market. And that woofer is specifically made for open baffle use. So it sort of accounts for what it's losing.
So you've just explained what I tried to explain before in a far more detailed and far more eloquent way than I ever did, Srajan. So thank you for that, because I've learned something there, that you've clarified what I kind of thought I knew, but not really, obviously. So
that's good then. And there's one more thing, that open baffle should have a little bit of room from the front wall, which is the wall that we're looking at. The reason for that, though, is that if you were to put that speaker right up against the wall, the radiation that comes out from the back reflects off the wall immediately, right? So now that is canceling out or interfering with the front going wave. So you're not only losing output to the sides, you're also losing outputs towards the listener. So you want to move the speakers away from the front wall so that the phase relationship of the rear wave reflecting off the front wall changes so that it no longer interferes with the front going radiation. So that's why you want a little bit of room, and usually they recommend about 1 meter. 80 centimeters to 1.5 meters, that tends to be sufficient. So open baffles are not entirely happy, or not as happy as they could be if you put them flat up against the wall, but they can be right up against the side wall, which you would probably want to toe them in. I'm trying to look to make that, so that they're now aiming at your ears. But it's $32.95. Now I would have to look up whether that includes shipping. I'm not sure. But so if we include shipping and VAT and all of that, and call it $3,500 delivered, we're looking at a speaker that, for all intents and purposes, is supposed to be full range and not that hard to drive, and should do really well in small to medium-sized rooms.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely an interesting concept, and I think with the right design, they can look absolutely superb in a room. But I do, I mean, I don't want to bag on Magnapan, but they do have. I mean, it's not. I know it's not the same driver type or anything like that, but you've still got a dipole design, right, with a Magnapan speaker, right?
Yes, but what you don't have with a Magnapan is you don't have the same excursion potential that you have with a dynamic driver, which is why some people find that Magnapans are super transparent, but maybe not as dynamic as they would like, and very often in the bass, not quite as hung, unless you go and you get one of those real big room divider type Magnapans.
Yeah, but I mention them because of the aesthetics. Because I mean, I love what Magnapan do, but the aesthetics side of things, not so much. Even though I would really love to get a pair of LRS Plus here, I think that might happen actually. Maybe, fingers crossed, if I can pull it off. But I like the idea of a flat speaker in the room. I think it can look really smart if placed nicely, and I think they can look really good. And I think even though they can be taller, because there's no depth to them, there's no physical depth really, they don't seem to be as physically imposing as a proper box floor stander, especially at the moment where the trend for box floor standers is narrow front baffle and then deep, right? Which I know the Europeans seem to love it. It's certainly very popular here. And I think that can make speakers look really big. And I think the KEF LS60 wireless look big because of it. And I don't know where I'm going with this really, but I just think that the open baffle side of things is not just a sonic thing for me. It's an aesthetics thing as well.
Right, and I think that's where Clayton really made advances, because the early Emerald Physics CS2 was sort of like a Van der Steen type sock affair. Right. So you had the open baffle, you had the drivers, but then you had like a grill cloth that sort of was hiding the protruding magnets in the back, and was also covering up the front two woofers. And now he has solid wood, and there was originally a photo of a red lacquered baffle. And I asked Clayton whether he was still thinking about offering lacquers for those people that want them. And he said that he had originally used red lacquer on MDF. And he said that didn't sound the same.
Oh, okay.
Right now, he has scratched the MDF solution, even though it was exactly the same dimensions, same thickness, everything. And now he's experimenting with lacquering his maple solid wood to see whether he can get an agreeable finish quality on it. If he does, there will be lacquers available, but they will obviously come for a surcharge. They won't be able to sell for the same as an unfinished wooden plank.
Yeah, a lacquered colored pair would be right up my street. Really would. Yeah.
What did I forget?
Probably nothing.
The only thing that I forgot was that, each speaker weighs 35 pounds.
So 18 kilos? 19 kilos?
So, it's reasonably easy to move about. And if in a particular install, the interior designer just absolutely insisted to park them up against the wall, well, you move them up against the wall, and when you want to listen, you move them out. They're still light enough where that is not an issue whatsoever.
Yep.
And the last thing we should probably say is that here we have two 12-inch drivers that behave like a 17-inch woofer, crossing over at 1 kilohertz to a 1-inch tweeter. And where have we seen something kind of sort of similar before? With Zoo. They have a 10.3-inch woofer, mid-woofer, that crosses over to a tweeter at a very, very high 8 or 10 kilohertz. And what do we get from that? We get a big driver that is handling mid-range and going all the way up to the lower treble. And from that, we expect, and usually always we get a beefier, meatier vocal band, and we may not get quite the same sort of separation powers, and maybe not quite the same sense of sort of snap and speed up in the presence region. 1, 2, 3 kilohertz, maybe slightly below, just because we've got a bigger driver with more cone surface and more moving mass. So a little bit less resolution, but definitely more sort of chunkiness and what Zoo calls shove, to sense that music is sort of, it's moving air, because we've got a 12-inch, got two 12-inch mid-ranges rather than the speaker I'm looking at right now has a 5.25-inch mid-range. And this is something else we should mention, that because of the acoustic short circuit that the open baffle figure 8 creates, you can get similar bass in terms of extension from a 5.25-inch modern woofer in a ported box that an open baffle needs two 12-inch woofers to do.
But it won't sound the same.
Will not sound the same, and the open baffle will move a hell of a lot more air. So when that kick drum hits, if you look at a kick drum, at a bass drum, how big that thing is, it's massive. And so when that gets hit, and you have a tiny driver trying to reproduce that, it may go low enough, just like my headphones would, but you certainly don't get that sense of
push,
moving air.
Yeah, yes, I understand what you mean, yeah.
Yeah, and that's where I think open baffles really excel, because they have to apply that much cone surface. Especially if you listen to symphonic classical music, where you have like 50, 60, 70, sometimes 80 people in the orchestra. And when 80 people get loud, they get a lot louder than, a string quartet or a jazz trio. And loudness means moving air in the room.
Yeah.
And so
this is definitely a speaker to watch, isn't it? It really is. To see see what comes of this. Okay, so I think my my next news item is possibly a little bit more pedestrian, right? Now, it comes from Rotel, and because, Srajan, last time you gave us such a wonderful sort of summary of Acoustic Energy's history, I thought I would just do a little bit of digging into Rotel's history, because I visited their factory about 10 years ago in China. I'll get to this in a moment. And they gave us the history then, but obviously I've forgotten it. But when I reread it just now, I was like, oh, yeah, that's right. So Rotel, I think, was founded in the 60s, but it started as a Japanese distribution company for an American television brand.
Okay.
And because, there goes your squeakiness, Jana, because Rotel had to modify the TVs coming in to a different voltage, because I think that there's a 10-volt discrepancy between the USA and Japan. They obviously were in the electronics business from the get-go. And then they moved into sort of OEM manufacturing. And then they started their own range of audio electronics under the Rotel brand. And I think, if I've got this right, some of the development was done in the UK. Some of it was done in Japan. And because of that UK facility, they got to know, or somehow formed an alliance with Bowers and Wilkins back in the 80s, right? And I think they ran parallel with global distribution with Bowers. So Bowers would distribute all Rotel electronics in whichever territory they were, operating. And then in the mid-2000s, I think that collaboration became even closer when, I don't know, I've got no idea who suggested it, because I think electronics were made in Japan until that point. But Bowers said, why don't we just get our own factory in Zhuhai in China, which is the one I've been to, and we'll make everything there. Now, you would think that might cause a dip in quality, but it's certainly not anything I've noticed. And in fact, I've got a Japanese Rotel integrated here, an affordable one, the same one that I owned in about 92. And I've also got, I did have, I actually gave it away to a patron. I've got to get this right. Called the A11 Tribute amplifier? And that's obviously made in Zhuhai. And I thought the A11 Tribute sounded better. And the key, I think, to Rotel's success is they wind their own transformers. This is something that should never be ignored with their gear. They're not buying them in from anybody else. They wind them in-house. There's a bunch of photos that I took back in 2014, 15? I went 14, I think, of people winding transformers. So just because it's China doesn't mean it's shit. And this factory was, I mean, I know they're putting on a show for us when we go. I went with a bunch of Australian dealers because the Australian distributor organised that tour. But it was absolutely fascinating. It was really cool. And we saw the Bowers part of the factory as well. They were making some of the more affordable speakers, I think they were doing there. Anyway, so sort of bring it up to date, Rotel have been, I would say, quite slow in producing amplifiers that have a streaming board inside so they can do music streaming. But then I think it was the end of 2022. So only, the end of last year, they released the S14, which is a streaming amplifier. I think it sells, I'm looking at my notes here, sells for $2,500. But that's not what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about something even newer, something called the RAS-5000, the RAS-5000. Now, this is one of these big, chunky Rotels. It's not like the slimline one, the S14 is. This is one of the big, taller ones. It's got a nice screen on the front, so obviously shows you cover art, metadata, because this one also does streaming. So the basics of it is all Class AB because of the toroidals that they wind. Although I think they did have a dalliance with Class D for a while, but they walked that back and went back to Class AB. This is Class AB, 140 watts per channel into 8 ohms, 220 into 4, right? So it's pretty powerful, I guess, on the Class AB side of things, probably why it's so big. And there's probably a honking great, toroidal right in the middle of that amplifier, I would think. There's an ESS DAC inside, which I think it's interesting, actually, reading press releases now where many manufacturers are refusing to say which DAC chip. And I think they do this because they don't want their product to be prejudged by the terminally online who never leave their house, never listen to anything, and will judge everything from the spec sheet, right? So if you say you've got an ESS Labs DAC, but you don't say which one, I think that's smart business, because then you're not inviting people to go, oh, it's only got a 9023 or a 9034, whatever the numbers are, right? I mean, yes, they can tell you. So if there's the flagship, whatever ESS DAC chip, it can give you a hint as to what it might sound like. But somebody could take that chip, implement it poorly, and make it sound terrible, right? Or somebody could take one of the lesser chips and implement it beautifully and make it sound wonderful. So anyway, this is, So, John,
well,
I think
the other thing is, remember when the AKM factory in Japan burned down and suddenly there was a shortage of that chip?
Yeah.
A lot of manufacturers that were embracing the AKM chips had to switch to ESS.
Yep.
And I think that also made them aware. And plus, then we had COVID and we had parts shortages anyways, that if you advertise your product as using a particular integrated chip, and that chip suddenly is not available, and you have to redesign the product, and you only have to redesign it not because it was bad or because you want to make it better. It's just you've lost access to a part. If you've never advertised a part to begin with, you can quietly make the necessary change.
Yes.
And that's it. If you talk about the part and suddenly you no longer use it, you now must tell the client that he's no longer getting the ESS 9038. And it's an AKM chip in there or whatever. I think that's another reason why we are seeing sort of less disclosure on chips.
Possibly. I mean, some manufacturers use chip disclosure as for bragging rights, basically, especially if they're using a 9038 Pro. But there are so many different minor SKUs that ESS offer. And some of them are mobile-centric, so they need lower power. And they're not as good sound-wise, I don't think, from what I gather, as the sort of the desktop version, right? So you could see 9038 and think, oh, that's really good. But is it the Pro or is it the mobile version? So you really have to dig pretty hard. And, coming back to what you just said about disclosure and then having to update, that happened to RME with their ADI DAC2 FS, whatever it's called. Because I bought one of those a few years ago. It uses an AKM chip. I didn't buy it because of the AKM. I just bought it because people were raving about it. But they've had to switch to ESS, as have many manufacturers. Although one manufacturer who I won't name, I've heard that they switch from AKM to ESS and aren't going back, even though AKM are back in business, because apparently the pricing being offered to them by AKM is what this manufacturer calls a joke. So I think in some ways it's better not to have a certain brand in your product, because then you will be put side by side by the terminally online to compare in a theoretical way. Even though that's completely erroneous, people still do it because people want to shop from the comfort of their internet station, right? That bugs me, actually. As you can tell, it kind of annoys me that people do that, because there's no substitute for listening, and yet people, I think, through wishful thinking, want it to be, and it isn't. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this product, was not just because it's a new streaming amplifier from Rotel, but it's a vehicle to make this point that DAC chips aren't everything, and we have to consider the analog output stage that follows the DAC, the power supply that feeds the DAC, all of these things that I don't know, I've become a bit of a broken record about, but I'll still talk about them in every opportunity, because I think the message, needs to be sort of pushed out there on a regular basis. But this ESS DAC in this Rotel amplifier, it does do MQA. I don't know why. Well, who knows what's going to happen with MQA these days? I've got no idea. Until we know, it's not really something I think DAC manufacturers could really brag about, because at this stage in the game, it's only really on Tidal, and Tidal are phasing it out. So until a new streaming player enters the market, MQA is until that point, MQA is a has-been, right? Until that changes. It might change, I don't know. But anyway, to get to the real meat of this Rotel story, it has a streaming board inside, which does Spotify Connect, Tidal Connect, AirPlay 2, Roon Ready, and Google Chromecast, which Chromecast wasn't very popular a few years ago, and I think it's being rolled out into more products. And I think the reason is Stream Unlimited, who are the OEM manufacturer of many boards that go into many different products. So they're an Austrian company who make a streaming board that they sell to other hi-fi companies. Say, hey, we can give you a turnkey solution for your amplifier, your DAC or whatever. You put it in, you have to tweak the software. We could probably help you with that for a fee. And the reason I think this is a Stream Unlimited board is because of the inclusion of Chromecast, because I know, I'm not going to mention the speaker, a certain speaker manufacturer put a Stream Unlimited board into their speaker a couple of years ago, and it has the exact same streaming feature set. And it's not like a Bluesound, because Bluesound doesn't have Chromecast. Mm-hmm. So I mean, it's good. It's good for the customer, because that's pretty much everything. If you've got Spotify, Tidal Connect, AirPlay, Roon Ready, and Chromecast, I think you've got everything apart from Plex or Plex Amp. Now, I'll just mention Plex Amp now very briefly, in that that's a way of streaming from a Plex server the music content using an app on your phone and sending it to basically another version of that app elsewhere on your network. Now, at the moment, I can't remember if I've mentioned this before, but possibly I'll become a broken record about this, Srajan, as well. At the moment, you can only really stream to Plex Amp running on a Raspberry Pi. But Lumen have just put it in their streamer. I think we have talked about this before. And there's another manufacturer who is using a board from Lumen, possibly, maybe. I don't know whether I'm allowed to say that or not, but I think I am. And so that might get Plex Amp next year. So I think we're going to see the ascendancy, certainly in my world anyway, we're going to see the ascendancy of Plex Amp as being another prong on the sort of streaming fork, right? So, Spotify Connect, Tidal Connect, AirPlay, Chromecast, Roon, and then the sixth one will be Plex Amp. So there's another reason to mention this, even though it does everything you could possibly want it to. But I think Plex Amp is essentially a free alternative that's not as powerful as Roon, doesn't look quite as good, but it's still pretty damn good. I guess Squeeze Light would be another one. Why don't you mention Squeeze Light, John? I love Squeeze Light, but it's just another one that probably wouldn't really factor into most products like a Rotel, because a Rotel amplifier is pitched at high street dealer type sales, right?
Mhm.
It goes next to your Cambridge, next to your Marantz. The tradition. I mean, I grew up on Cambridge, Rotel, and Marantz, seeing those in my local hi-fi stores in the 90s, which is why I owned a Rotel in the 90s, because it was the sleek design. I liked the sound of it. It got a rave review in What Hi-Fi. I thought, yeah, I'll just get that. It was 100 and something quid. And I've still got one. It still sounds great, So anyway, but now obviously Rotel are moving with the times. They're doing streaming at last. And lastly, and this is again another broken record topic for me, HDMI ARC is in this amplifier. You know how last time I was saying it really needs to be in amplifiers that sell to sort of the more mom and dad type consumer? The kind of dude or dudette who walks into a hi-fi store going, oh, I wonder what, I've got some money, I can improve the sound of my TV, right? Can't do it unless you've got HDMI ARC. Well, you can. You have to use Toslink. That's not as compelling as HDMI ARC, I don't think, for the reasons we discussed last time. I won't go into that here. So anyway, this RAS-5000, interestingly, sells for only $500 more than the S14. And it's more powerful, it's bigger, it's got better connectivity, it's got the display on the front. I mean, I just think this looks like a good alternative to, say, the Cambridge Evo 150 or the Name Unity Atom, even though those are probably more lifestyle sort of focused products in that they've been beautifully designed to look attractive in a home. Whereas the Rotel looks like a Rotel, really, like big. Well, I'm looking at the silver version, big shiny faceplate, but obviously you can get black as well. There's a headphone socket on the front, big volume control. So I'm all about Rotel. I think they make great stuff. So hats off to them to finally kind of catching up with the rest of the world. Sorry, I don't mean that in a patronizing way. Any questions, Srajan, before we move on?
No, just you said it was $500 more than, but what does it end up being for this piece you were just talking about? What's the final retail price?
The final retail price is $3,000 US. So the S14, the slimline one that came out at the end of last year, $2,500. This one's $3,000. I think looks like the much bigger deal. And I don't think the S14, if I'm correct, I don't think it had HDMI ARC on it. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm not. No, it doesn't have HDMI ARC on it. So, yeah, I think the RAS-5000 is the much better deal.
And again, we're talking black and silver available?
Black and silver, yeah, as always, with Rotel gear. So, yeah, that's my first news item of the day, Srajan.
Now we're going to go to Shakespeare and Hamlet and Denmark.
Okay.
So you know that if you go from Berlin to Hamburg and then you keep traveling north, you hit Flensburg and then you cross the border and you're in Denmark. And if you keep going up, it's called the Northern Jutland Peninsula. And Jut, I always think as, sticking out.
Juts out, yes.
Yeah. So on the Northern Jutland Peninsula of Denmark, we have a company called Dantax Radio SA. And Dantax today owns the brands Rido and Scansonic. Now, they also used to own a brand called Gamut Audio. And Gamut Audio was a speaker company whose designer is called Benno Baun-Melgaard. And Rido and Scansonic were originally founded by Lars Christensen and Michael Burrison. And when the financial crisis hit, their business took a hit, and Dantax Radio sort of rescued or absorbed the brands Rido and Scansonic, and then eventually decided to divest themselves of Gamut, because they couldn't have three different loudspeaker brands under one roof, design them all, market them, sell them. So Gamut went the way of the dodo, but the designer Benno Baun-Melgaard reappeared with Griffin Audio Designs, where he designed the EOS two-way floor stander. And currently he's working on his own company. He's going to come up with something very, very high-end with its own drivers,
Okay.
again loudspeakers, but that is still in the development phase. So we've mentioned now Michael Burson as the original designer of Rido. Michael Burson, with his business partner, founded another company.
Mm-hmm.
And the speaker part is called Burson Audio.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why it's important to mention that is because to this day, Rido loudspeakers and Burson loudspeakers share a lot of design DNA. In fact, they also look surprisingly similar. Now, when Michael Burson left Rido, Benno Baum-Melgaard of Gamut was still in the company, and he became the new designer of Rido and Scansonic. And sort of he revoiced the original Burson designed Ridos, which sort of changed their sonic signature. Today, Rido and Scansonic no longer have a celebrity designer. Now they hire contract engineers whenever they have a new project. And the way I was told is Denmark has so many first-rate engineers, there's no need for us to keep somebody permanently on staff. We hire somebody when we need them, and we hire somebody specific to the project that we're after.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, Rido are very, very expensive loudspeakers, and Scansonic has always been sort of the trickle-down receiver of Rido speakers.
Mm.
And at the show in Munich this year, Scansonic announced a new range, and it's called the Q range. And the Q range supposedly has the most Rido DNA ever. And it is the first time that Scansonic has an 8-inch driver. And it's also the first time, I believe, that Scansonic and possibly even Rido have three-way speakers. Because Michael Burson's preference has always been for 2.5-way speakers when he needed more cone surface than a 2-way speaker can provide. And Rido kept the faith with the 2.5-way credo up until the Q range. So in the Q range, we have 3 models. They're called the Q3, the Q8, and the Q10.
Mm-hmm.
And the Q3 is using 2 5.25-inch carbon fiber midwoofers in a 2.5-way design. Still classic Scansonic. But then the Q8 becomes the 3-way. Now it has 1 5.25-inch midwoofer, and then it has an 8-inch carbon fiber woofer in a 3-way configuration. And the top line, Q10, doubles up on the woofers. Now we have 2 8-inch woofers. The tweeter remains the famous Michael Burson designed and then evolved planar magnetic. Unfortunately, both Scansonic and Burson still refer to it as a ribbon, and it's not.
Mm-hmm.
It's a planar magnetic, just like in an Odyssey headphone.
Mm-hmm.
And the difference is that a planar magnetic has a voice coil attached to the membrane, whereas in a ribbon, the entire membrane itself, aluminum, is conductive. It doesn't need a voice coil etched on it. And the ribbon has its magnet top and bottom, and there's nothing sort of fronting or backing the membrane, whereas on a planar magnetic, you have magnets at least on one side. If it's a push-pull design, then you have magnets on both sides, like we would see in a Hi-Fi Man Susvara headphone, and you sort of see these window shutter magnets sort of covering half of the membrane of the planar magnetic driver. So that's the tweeter that's inside all of the Q range models. Now let me get this right. Pricing starts at $7,000 a pair, goes all the way up to $15,000 for the top model. The standard finish is always a piano gloss black lacquer. And then for 2,000 euros more, you can get a walnut veneer.
Okay.
So you're starting at 7 in black for the smallest one, add 2, and now you come out at 9K for the smallest one in veneer, until you get to 15,000 for the veneer for the top one.
Okay.
All of the speaker cabinets are very modern looking in that they have the narrowest possible front baffle, just wide enough for the drivers. And then they really, really slim to the rear, where they are only about 2, at the very most, 3 fingers width wide, which is why the speaker terminals actually have to mount top and bottom.
Right.
They can't mount side by side because there's not enough room.
Mm-hmm.
And not only does the cabinet slim to the rear, then the spine actually has a curvature built in.
Mm.
And the cheeks are also curved. They're narrowing to the side. And then the whole speaker also slightly leans back. So it's a very attractive design that again mirrors what Raido have done for their expensive speakers.
Mm.
And that, I think, is pretty much all I've got, except for that if we go to the Q10 with its dual 8-inch woofers, that, if you add it up together, because again, we are talking about parallel drivers, we have an 11.3-inch woofer.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Person's flagship speaker today sells for €500,000.
Really? Oh my goodness.
$500,000.
Okay.
It's called the M6, and it needs 6 4.25-inch drivers to come up with the equivalent of an 11-inch woofer. So for all intents and purposes, the most expensive €15,000 Scansonic Q10 has the same cone surface as a $500,000 Burson speaker. Now,
Yeah.
obviously, the Burson speaker divides that cone surface over multiple motors, so you have less excursion, you're applying more flux and all of that. But in terms of bandwidth, in terms of like how low will this thing play, we would probably expect equivalency.
Okay. I mean, when I hear those kinds of price numbers, I always my first thought is not, oh my God, that's a ripoff, because that's just childish thinking, really. It's okay, what kind of room would I need to do that justice? And therefore, what kind of house would I need to have the room to do the speakers justice, right? So this is for somebody who's got, I would assume, at least not a very large listening room, but something that's sizable and possibly treated, because you're not going to put it into an echo box, because then you're just throwing money away. Literally, you're lighting it on fire, right? So I think my personal take on this is the more you spend on speakers, the more you have to factor in the room in order to do justice to those things. I'm not saying that room treatments don't have any effect on affordable speakers. Absolutely, they do. But it's kind of like, well, you're spending. I mean, my next news item is below $500. So basically, if I had a pair of $500 stand mounts, I'm not going to worry about treating the room, because it's why would I spend 10 grand on a room treatment for a $500 speaker? But if I've got a $500,000 speaker and somebody said to me, John, you'd spend 50 grand on your room, so 10%, that makes sense, right? Even though 50 grand in here, I mean, if I spent 50 grand on room treatment in here, I would want it to be invisible, right? So it would look
good luck,
but it would just be a room within a room, right? You'd build the room within the room and make it invisible and whatever. But it's just, this is where my mind goes when I hear about very expensive speakers. And because what I see in my YouTube comments is people, and I was discussing this with Livornia the other day on the phone, a lot of people out there seem to have an inability to conceive of people different from them and their circumstances. At least that's the way it comes across in the comments, right? Like, who buys this stuff? Only fools spend their money on this kind of thing. No, there are plenty of people out there who've got shit tons of money who don't necessarily flaunt it. Some people do, but not all of them. I mean, I can think of areas of Sydney where there's just like so many multi-million-dollar houses that would easily accommodate speakers like these, like big swathes of the city, not just like little pockets, like big areas. And I guess out near Grunewald here would be the same, right? So I guess what I'm saying is they walk among us, right? Rich people that, don't flaunt it.
And the cars drive amongst us. I mean, there's Ferraris going down the road, and there is, Humvees, and there is very expensive cars. Usually people don't get quite as annoyed by the existence of expensive cars. They don't necessarily say, what a fool that somebody just, has a Porsche 911 and he's living out here in Ireland where everything is potholes and there's sheep running around the street, and you can't do 180 kilometers an hour.
Right.
You can't even do 120. So what use is the Porsche? But people do appreciate that it's a toy, and some people that have the money enjoy the toy. Well, there is some sort of Formula One type technology in these very, very expensive Burson speakers, and there's a lot of silver in there. I mean, there is kilograms worth of pure silver in them. There is a reason for the material cost, and of course, it's a big company with more than 50 employees. They all have to get paid. The dealers want to make their profit. I mean, all of that keeps piling on.
And the R&D.
Yeah, but if you part the curtain, there is a lot of like raw material cost and procedures that go into this $500,000 speaker, including, for example, cryogenic treatment.
Right.
And actually buying their own cryogenic vats in the factory to do all of this in-house. And 3D printing, a basket from zirconium.
Okay.
And I don't know how many days it takes to actually print this basket, one little sort of drop at a time. And, you could argue whether that's sensible, and you could wonder how much better is that than a standard printed or, stamped aluminum basket. But the fact is, it's in there, and some people appreciate that.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. All right, well, let me play my yin to your yang, Srajan, with a super affordable product. And now this comes from another Japanese company who not only make hi-fi, they make pianos and motorbikes, because of course they do.
Yamaha, it must be.
It's Yamaha. Of course it's Yamaha. Now, I guess I wrote about this on my website after our last discussion about Neumann and their active stand mounts, right? And in that time, I have been to visit Neumann. They got in touch and said, "Do you want to come around and have a look?" And they gave me the full tour. It was very, very generous of them to take the time out. And there's a lot going on there. They've got an entire anechoic chamber. My first time in there, that was pretty wild, actually. That was great. But it kind of made me realize that I need to cover more of this sort of powered active speaker territory on the website, if nowhere else, or certainly here as well when we're covering news items. And this one popped up just in my Facebook feed, whereas generally I learn a lot about new products coming to market just through Facebook, because I'm not on Yamaha's press list. So I had to dig into this. Now, I'll get to why I'm talking about this particular speaker in a moment. But there's two of them, actually. There's two pairs of speakers, HS3, HS4. Now, I think the DNA for these speakers is the NS10. So the NS10 is the passive speaker that you see in the background of many sort of talking head studio interviews. It's like a black box, white mid-bass driver, right? Now, it's not the best sounding speaker by all accounts. I've never really heard a pair. No, I did once. Yeah, it was okay. But I think the idea is if you can make it sound good on that, you can be pretty confident it'll sound good on other things as well. So it's another benchmark. So now they've got this thing called these things called the HS3 and the HS4. And these, again, are like pint-sized stand mounts, but they're powered loudspeakers. And that's why I want to talk about these, because I want to explain the way I understand it, Srajan, the difference between powered and active, because the Neumann we spoke about last time were active loudspeakers. So an active loudspeaker, let me wind it back. Let's talk about a normal hi-fi system, right? Let's say you've got a pair of NS10s, right? You're going to need an outboard amplifier for that. So your amplifier is connected to your speakers with speaker cable. And the signal comes out of the amp and goes into the speaker, and it meets the crossover on the other side of the speaker terminals on the back of the speaker. And then that's what splits the sound between the two drivers, right?
Correct.
And obviously the crossover smooths the frequency response and hopefully sorts out any phase issues if it can. But it's made from passive components. So capacitors, inductors, resistors, right? And that's how most audiophiles tend to see hi-fi. It's like, I got my passive speakers and my outboard amplifier, and that's me, and that's all I need to know. Whereas active speakers don't work that way. They basically move the amplification onto the other side of the crossover. So you have a crossover. Now, it can be done with active components, but generally nowadays, for most things that we talk about, it's done in DSP. So the crossover splits the signal between the two drivers inside the speaker, and then it goes to a DAC for each driver, and then an amp for each driver, and then the drivers move, right? So I mention all of this as a very convoluted way to explain that basically with an active system, the amplification comes after the crossover. And in a passive system, the amplification comes before the crossover. Do you want to interject here, Srajan, with any clarifications or errors I've made? Because I might have done. It's possible.
No, but we should say why there is an advantage to the active way.
I wasn't going to go there, but okay. We can. Yeah, let's do it.
Well, it's actually very basic. It's like when you take these passive components that can absorb energy and release it later, and they can incur oscillations, they can absorb, hold, and then release energy time delayed. If you take that out and you direct connect the amplifier directly to the voice coil of the driver, you have more control.
And the amplifier only has to operate in the bandwidth of that driver, right?
Correct, which is why very often in active speakers, you see that they list or specify a Class AB amp for the tweeter.
Yes.
And nearly always a Class D amp for the woofer.
Yes.
Because the woofer now doesn't have to reproduce high frequencies. And in that line of thinking, it's Class D wouldn't be as advantageous in the treble, where Class AB may sound better. But in the bass, hands down, Class D is superior. So that's how you can split the two of them.
Right. So back with the Yamaha. So basically, each one of these is a two-way. So in the HS3, we've got a 3/4 inch fabric tweeter and a 3.5 inch mid-bass driver. It's tiny, right? And the HS4 has a 1 inch tweeter and a 4.5 inch mid-bass driver. But these are only designed for desktops, small rooms, that kind of thing. Now, I've got to look at the amplification here. And if I was looking for an active speaker, I would be looking, as you've just said, what kind of amp is on the tweeter? What kind of amp is on the mid-bass driver? But we don't get that information. Why? Well, because this is not an active speaker. Basically, what Yamaha have done is they've taken the sort of traditional audiophile outboard amplifier and just put it in one of the speaker boxes. Correct. And then that is fed into an internal crossover, passive crossover, inside one of the speaker boxes, and that drives the two drivers in there. And then there's a normal speaker wire interlink to the other speaker, which that same amplifier, the right-hand channel or the left-hand channel, depends on which way they've got them oriented, will then power the crossover inside that speaker as if it were a passive speaker, because essentially it is a passive speaker just with an amplifier inside the box.
Correct.
So I mention this because it's very easy to look at like a powered speaker like this Yamaha and think, well, that's an active. That's just a cheaper version of the Neumann that John spoke about last time. And that's absolutely not the case. We get none of the advantages of active speakers because they're not. They're just basically passive speakers with the amp moved inside one of the speaker boxes, which is why they sell for, let me look this up. The HS3 is €250 a pair. The HS4, slightly bigger one, €285 a pair. Now, I'm not doing it to shit on these. I think for the right customer, like if I was starting out and didn't have any money, this would be a good choice just to start me out, especially if I was, wanting to do music production at home. I mean, I don't know whether they're voiced in that kind of, I say voiced. Actually, I was talking to an engineer who we'll talk about in a bit the other day, and he's got a bunch of active speakers at home. And I was saying to him, okay, so why do audiophiles, in your mind, object so much to active speakers? Is it because they sound, in inverted commas, too neutral? He's like, yeah. So I said, well, does it therefore follow that basically audiophiles like color? They want a certain color to their sound? He's like, yeah, I think so. But they won't, this is my words, but they won't admit it, will they? They want to say, oh, my speaker is extremely neutral. And yet when they hear an active speaker, like a studio type speaker, they go, oh no, that's too neutral. So like, which one is it? Like if you say you've got a straight wire with gain at home, and then you go hear a Neumann and go, oh no, that's way too revealing for my tastes, too neutral, then what do you have at home? Like it's got to be colored by definition. So I don't know where these Yamaha fall on that scale. The amplifier module is a Class D. Does it say in my notes how many? I think it might have done, but I can't find it right now. Anyway, there's a Class D amp that powers this. I mean, it'll be enough, I think, to produce a reasonably good SPL. But it's a starter speaker, right? It's for something that if you've got a kid going to college, you buy them a pair of these because if you're a good parent, you won't buy them a separate amp and separate speakers because that's a pain. These two will come in a box. You just, yoink that around. And the other thing I'll say about these is that despite there being no DAC in them or anything like that, these would make a much better TV speaker than any soundbar. For $250, you get a DAC with a Toslink connection to your TV. Have these speakers on the ends of your sideboard underneath the telly. Will sound way better than a soundbar. You won't get as much bass, but it will just sound clearer and more, I guess, just more satisfying, I think. I really have it. Sorry, go on.
I mean, plus, of course, since they are individual speakers, you can space them where you want.
And you get the width.
The soundbar is fixed by definition, so your soundstage can possibly not be wider than, I mean, even if that thing is 1 meter wide. Whereas if you put the speakers 2 meters apart, you will have a 2 meter wide soundstage.
Yep.
My question to you is, since I have not seen these Yamaha, what do they look like? Are they like injection molded plastic cabinets or regular MDF cabinets with like a fake wood veneer, like a plastic wood veneer, or what does it look like?
It's kind of hard to tell. it is MDF. Yes, MDF cabinets, and they're covered in some kind of vinyl. I guess it's like a black vinyl or a white vinyl. You have the choice of the two.
Gotcha.
I mean, a vinyl is probably the standard.
At that price. Yeah.
And there's a volume control on the front of the speaker. So, I just think this is a great starter kit, a great soundbar replacement. I really have it in for soundbars because, as you say, they can only go as wide as they are long. And speakers are wider. Even if they're cheaper, they're going to be better than a soundbar. I know some soundbar manufacturers try and trick us with marketing by saying, well, we can fire a driver this way and it'll hit the sidewall and it'll bounce back. And like, what if you've got no sidewall? Like, what if it opens out into a dining area? Right? It's just, I won't say it's willfully deceptive, but it's a little bit loose, isn't it? I mean, it really is. Whereas with these, you look at two speakers, you kind of know what you're going to get, I think, really. So, so hopefully people will understand, even though I explained it again in a convoluted way, the difference between a powered speaker and an active loudspeaker. I will add this. You can get an active speaker where the amps sit outside of the speaker cabinet. So you have a bit like the Emerald Physics, right? The crossover is outside. The amps are outside as well, right? But the amps are still on the driver's side of the crossover. So you go crossover, amplifiers, drivers, right?
And it makes it an active crossover.
Yes, and and that needs power. That needs to be juiced by something. So normally we see it inside the speaker, right, with your Kefs and Genelec. Somebody said to me, John didn't mention Genelec last week, and it was like he was trying hard not to. And I'm like, no, I've actually got a pair of Genelec that I never use. They're sitting upstairs. In fact, I've got a little squat pair in my office in Portugal as well. I love Genelec speakers. They're great, but they're also actives. But actives are generally the preserve of the pro world, although they are slowly bleeding into the hi-fi world. But I don't think the hi-fi world is entirely ready for it. Some customers are, but not everyone. And I sort of understand why. But anyway. We should move on, Srajan, because we're already over time. And,
all right,
and we know we come to your spicy section, right?
This will be quick. But I know you love the voodoo that I do.
It's Srajan's voodoo section, right? Yes.
Now, John, so have you ever given any thought to where the goods end up that you flush down the toilet every day?
Oh my goodness!
Or the trash the garbage truck picks up like once or twice every week?
No, once it's disappeared from my house. I mean, I have a bin room downstairs where I have to take my garbage and put it in a big wheelie bin that gets wheeled out by the garbage men twice a week. But yeah.
I like to use that as an example for certain things that once they're out of sight, out of mind, we don't pay any attention to them. Now, I had reason to wonder where the doo-doo goes when my backyard started smelling. And I realized that there's a septic tank.
Okay.
And then I asked my landlord, and he confirmed that the prior tenants that had lived here more than 5 years never ever emptied out the septic tank.
Whoa.
So, I go online and I find a specialized truck that comes by, and lo and behold, he lifts the lid and there are all the goods. And he has a hose about this big. And he pumps out he pumps out this entire septic tank, which is like 7 years worth of crap, right?
Literally.
So now when he leaves, I ask him, I said, all that stuff that is now in your truck, where does that go? And he says, well, I drive it to Limerick, which is the closest really big city here. And we have a depot. And he said, there is these enormous vats sitting in the parking lot. And and I empty out my truck into those vats. I said, okay, where do those vats go? He says, I have no idea. Okay, so now let's rewind.
Okay.
And let's go to the trash. And when I was still living in Taos, New Mexico, every once in a while I had to go to the local landfill to get rid of some garbage that the garbage collectors wouldn't pick up. And you see this festering area with like birds dive bombing. It's smelly. It's terrible. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is because audio ground is very similar in that we don't see it. We hear manufacturers talking about shunting noise to ground, and we feel, yeah, that's fine. That's like a landfill. It's like we flush the toilet and it's gone. I don't have to worry about it anymore. Well, the other day, I reviewed something that purports to minimize noise on the ground plane. The company that sent me this is from Taiwan, and they are called Telos Audio. I'm not going to talk about what I heard, because I want our audience to wonder, or to maybe even in the comment section, speculate what they think the difference might be. And I have already given you a link to a video that you will run in the background while we're talking about this.
Well, I mean, we can show it now, and then we can come back after we've shown it.
一般的 switch 是使用这种交换式电源，它只有水火，然后就变成5伏特，所以这样子的 switch 的状况之下，它是没有接地状态的。那它机壳会有一个14伏特的漏电值。好，那我们现在已经启动了这个 Micro G RJ45，把 Micro G 的 RJ45动态的接地导入。我们就会看到这个时候它的这个机壳散发出来的漏电值是有接地的，接地状态就变成 0.3， 然后再把这个拿起来移除。所以 switch 接地的话就是这么方便。那它接地之后，它的那个杂讯就会往 Micro G 流过去，被这些电子电路去综合掉杂讯。
So we've seen the video, Srajan. So it's kind of it's a smartphone video essentially, right? Of two dudes chatting.
Basically what we saw a generic network switch with like 6 or 8 RJ45 plugs. And we saw two hands measuring the voltage differential on the ground. And it showed 14 volts. And then we see them plug in this device that I reviewed. So they use one of the network switches plugs, RJ45 plug. They plug their device in there. And the moment it plugs in, we see on the meter that the voltage differential drops down to 0.3 volts. That's like more than a magnitude of reduction in voltage differential on the ground plane.
Well, I would call that obliteration almost, pretty much. Like it's
almost. Well, on my behalf, you called Jürgen Reis of MBL in Berlin,
I did.
Who was a famous engineer who was very open to explaining things to us dumb reviewers.
He is brilliant at it, yes. I always phone him when I have
we asked him whether this voltage, whether that is the noise itself, or is it a condition which allows for noise to happen? And he says, no, that is the noise itself. He said that measurement alone does not tell us yet at what frequency the noise occurs and at what impedance. And he said that the frequency and the impedance of this voltage will determine where the noise will travel and what kind of damage it will do when it gets there.
Yes.
He said that we cannot tell from this measurement, but what we can tell is that the noise has been reduced significantly, and because of that, these other two factors have been weakened a lot.
Right, yes.
So this is not BS, this is completely factual, but since most of us never think about the ground, the only time we think about ground if we have a ground noise loop, we have hum. Happens very often with an active subwoofer. Suddenly our system hums. And then very often the solution is that if we have a 3-prong plug, we float it. So now we only have two, hot and ground, and we float the ground and suddenly the noise is gone. And now we think, no more ground noise, I'm home free. But the fact is that we have voltage differentials on the ground plane all the time. And if there is a device, and it's not an if, there is a device that can objectively lower that, what do we think this will do for our sound? And I'll be very curious to see the comment section of our audience to suggest what the sonic benefits might be, or does everybody think no difference whatsoever? It doesn't matter.